You don't realize how safe failure feels until success removes every place you used to hide. Losing money hurts, but it also explains everything. It gives you a story. It gives you an excuse. It gives you something to blame. The market was choppy. The setup wasn't clean. You rushed it. You weren't ready yet. Failure keeps the narrative open. Success closes it. The first time trading starts working, something subtle happens inside you. Not relief, tension, the kind that tightens your chest without you noticing. Because now the question is no longer whether trading can work. The question becomes whether you can handle what comes next. I remember the first week I realized I could actually be profitable if I just didn't interfere. That realization didn't feel empowering. It felt heavy. Because suddenly, every mistake had weight. Every impulsive decision mattered. Every loss couldn't be shrugged off as part of the learning phase anymore. I wasn't a beginner. I was accountable. And accountability is terrifying when you've been protected by struggle. Jordan blew 3 small accounts before he ever tasted consistency. Each loss hurt, but it also reset expectations. He told himself he was still learning. Still early, still figuring it out. Then 1 month, everything lined up. Same strategy, same rules. But something clicked internally. He ended green, then green again. By the 3rd week, he stopped sleeping well. He said he felt more anxious winning than he ever did losing, because winning removed the safety net. If you've ever felt more nervous during a winning streak than a losing one, like the video because that reaction confuses people who've never been there, failure keeps your identity intact. You're the underdog, the grinder, the one still on the come-up. Success forces a new identity, one where your actions have consequences that compound, one where discipline isn't optional anymore, one where you don't get to blame an experience. That's why traders sabotage themselves right when things start working. They don't consciously decide to fail, they just return to familiar patterns. Overtrading, increasing size too fast, ignoring rules they followed perfectly when they were desperate. Chaos feels familiar. Stability feels exposed. I watched this happen in myself in ways I didn't want to admit. There was a stretch where my system was solid, my execution was clean, and the numbers were moving steadily. Instead of feeling calm, I felt watched, like the market was waiting for me to mess it up. That pressure didn't come from charts, it came from success demanding consistency. And consistency leaves nowhere to hide. Maya traded well for 6 weeks straight. She followed her rules like scripture. Then one morning, she broke them on a trade that felt right. She couldn't explain why. The setup was average. The risk was higher than usual. She said later she just wanted to feel something. She won that trade, then lost the next 3. By the end of the week, she had given back half her gains. When she journaled it honestly, she wrote one sentence that said everything. Winning made her feel exposed. Losing made her feel normal. If you've ever felt more comfortable losing than being responsible for winning, comment something like, "That's real, so you understand this isn't weakness. It's conditioning." From the beginning, failure trains you to expect less. It lowers the bar. It lets you move emotionally without precision. You can trade loose because the stakes feel low. Success raises the bar quietly. It demands restraint. It demands patience when you don't feel desperate anymore. And that's harder than grinding. The market doesn't punish ambition, it punishes instability. When you're losing, instability is expected. When you're winning, instability is lethal. That's why success scares traders. Not because they fear money, but because they fear responsibility. I used to think confidence was the goal. It isn't. Confidence is fragile. It swings with results. The real shift happens when you realize success requires neutrality, emotional flatness, the ability to execute without attachment. That's uncomfortable for people who associate progress with intensity. There's a guy named Sam who always traded best after losses. Calm, focused, disciplined. But after wins, he became loose. He took shortcuts. He said he felt like he deserved them. That entitlement didn't come from ego. It came from relief. Relief that he wasn't losing anymore. Relief that made him drop his guard. If you've noticed you trade worse after winning, subscribe to the channel, because this is the psychology nobody prepares you for. Success forces you to confront a brutal truth. If you keep losing, you can always say you haven't arrived yet. If you start winning, you're no longer waiting. You're responsible for protecting what you've built. And protection requires boring discipline. structure without adrenaline, process without applause. That's why many traders unconsciously return to failure, not because they want to lose, but because failure feels manageable. Success feels like something you could ruin at any moment. I want you to think about this honestly. How many times have you been closer to profitability than you admitted? How many times did you pull back right when things stabilized? How many times did you change systems when the real discomfort wasn't the strategy, but the responsibility it created? If that question hits, like the video, because awareness is the first step out of this loop. This fear isn't talked about because it doesn't fit the motivational narrative. People sell the dream of winning without explaining the weight that comes with it. They show payouts, not pressure. Results, not restraint. But every trader who lasts learns the same lesson eventually. Losing teaches you resilience. Winning tests your maturity. And most people aren't prepared for that test. Success doesn't announce itself loudly when it arrives. It slips in quietly and rearranges the rules without asking permission. The habits that once helped you survive no longer fit the environment you're in, but they still feel familiar. And familiarity is seductive, especially when the stakes rise. When you're losing, urgency sharpens you. Every trade feels important. Every mistake feels educational. You pay attention because you have to. But when you're winning, urgency fades. You stop feeling hunted by the clock. And without urgency, your weaknesses finally get space to breathe. I noticed this pattern the first time my equity curve smoothed out. The stress that used to sit in my chest during every session disappeared. At first, that felt like freedom. Then it felt like danger. Because the edge I relied on before wasn't just my strategy, it was the pressure forcing me to behave. When that pressure left, I had to supply discipline myself. And that's a different level of responsibility entirely. There's a trader named Alex who told me his worst losses always came after his best weeks. He said it was like his brain didn't know how to live in stability. When things were going wrong, he became sharp, focused, precise. When things were going right, he relaxed. He didn't double his risk. He didn't revenge trade. He just stopped respecting the process. And that subtle disrespect cost him more than any emotional blow-up ever did. If you've ever felt yourself loosen up after a good run, like the video, because this is where most traders quietly undo their progress. The fear here isn't about losing money. It's about losing identity. When you struggle, your identity is clear. You're the learner, the grinder, the one on the path. Success threatens that identity. It asks you to step into a role where results are no longer hypothetical, where consistency isn't potential, it's expected. That expectation changes how losses feel. A loss during failure feels normal. A loss during success feels like a crack. And cracks trigger panic in people who are attached to outcomes. So instead of letting the system play out, they interfere. They tighten stops. They skip trades. They chase. Not because the system stopped working, but because their nervous system did. Priya went from inconsistent to steady over a few months. She didn't change strategies. She changed execution. When she finally accepted that her edge worked, she started second-guessing it. Every losing trade felt louder. Every drawdown felt more personal. She wasn't afraid of losing money. She was afraid of losing the version of herself that had finally figured it out. That's the paradox. Success raises the emotional cost of mistakes, and if you haven't trained neutrality, that cost will push you back into self-sabotage. This is why traders blow up after breakthroughs. They increase size too fast. They abandon patience. They take marginal setups. They want to capitalize on momentum instead of respecting probability. It looks like confidence from the outside. It's actually fear in disguise. Fear of missing the moment. Fear of losing the window. Fear that success is temporary unless they force it. If you've ever felt the urge to press harder when things were going well, subscribe, because this channel exists to slow you down before the market does it for you. The market doesn't reward urgency. It rewards alignment. And alignment requires stillness. Stillness is uncomfortable for people who associate progress with motion, especially people who grew up equating effort with worth. I came from that mindset. I believed if I wasn't actively doing something, I was falling behind. Trading punished that belief mercilessly. It taught me that doing less, but doing it cleanly, produced better results than constant engagement. That lesson sounds simple. Living it is not. There's a point where you realize failure never demanded maturity. It demanded persistence. Success demands both. It asks you to manage boredom, restraint, and delayed gratification simultaneously. And that combination exposes every unresolved habit you carry. If you've been successful in other areas of life, you might recognize this pattern. Promotions scare people. Stability scares people. Responsibility scares people. Because it removes the excuse of not knowing. It removes the comfort of being underestimated. It puts the weight back on you. Trading is no different. It just accelerates the exposure. I want you to reflect on something honestly. When you imagine yourself being consistently profitable, what scares you more? Losing money again, or being responsible for protecting it every single day? That answer tells you where the real work is. If this question makes you uncomfortable, like the video, because discomfort is where growth actually happens. Success doesn't fail traders. Their relationship with it does. The ones who survive learn to treat success the same way they treated failure. With process, with humility, with distance. They don't celebrate too high. They don't spiral too low. They don't change behavior based on emotion. They execute. And that neutrality feels empty to people who came to trading for validation. But it feels peaceful to people who came to build something real. Neutrality doesn't arrive all at once. It shows up in fragments. A trade you don't obsess over. A loss you log without emotion. A winning day that doesn't change how you sleep. These moments feel insignificant, but together they form the real edge. Not prediction, not timing. Emotional regulation under success. One of the strangest things about becoming profitable is how quiet it gets inside your head. The noise that used to fill your thoughts when you were losing disappears. No more bargaining with the market. No more mental math about how much you need to make back. That silence is unfamiliar, and for many traders, unfamiliar feels unsafe. There's a trader named Ben who told me he missed the chaos. He said when he was losing, trading gave him something to fight, something to fix. When he stabilized, there was nothing to battle anymore. Just execution, just waiting, just restraint. And that lack of struggle made him restless. He started tinkering, testing unnecessary changes, looking for friction where none existed. Not because the system failed, but because peace felt suspicious. If you've ever caught yourself creating problems after things calmed down, like the video, because that pattern doesn't come from stupidity, it comes from conditioning. Most people grow up equating stress with importance. If something doesn't feel intense, it doesn't feel meaningful. Trading success removes intensity. It replaces it with responsibility. And responsibility doesn't give dopamine. It gives obligation. That's why success feels heavier than failure. Failure still lets you fantasize. Success forces you to maintain. I noticed this shift when I stopped checking my account balance constantly. At first, that felt like discipline. Then it felt like avoidance. I asked myself why I didn't want to look. It wasn't fear of losing. It was fear of seeing stability and realizing I had no excuse to be reckless anymore. Stability demands restraint even when nobody is watching. There's a woman named Alina who said her biggest fear wasn't losing money. It was proving to herself that she could be consistent. Because once she did, she couldn't hide behind potential anymore. She couldn't say, one day. It was either now or she had to admit she didn't want the responsibility that came with it. That's the quiet truth most traders never say out loud. Failure allows dreaming. Success demands maintenance. This is where many traders unconsciously pull back. They reduce size unnecessarily. They skip good trades. They hesitate. They stall progress. On the surface, it looks like caution. Underneath, it's avoidance. Avoidance of stepping fully into a role that requires daily discipline without emotional payoff. There's also a social layer to this fear. When you fail, people sympathize. When you succeed, expectations rise. Suddenly, others assume you have answers. Suddenly, mistakes feel public. Even if nobody is watching, your mind acts like they are. Success puts you on an imaginary stage, and some people would rather step off than perform consistently. I felt this when people started asking me for advice. It made every loss feel heavier. Like I was letting someone down. I had to learn to separate my process from external perception. Trading doesn't care who's watching. It doesn't reward image, it rewards execution. This is why many traders stay quiet once they become consistent. Not out of secrecy, out of protection. They protect their mental space, they protect their routines. They protect themselves from expectations that don't serve the process. If you're the type who needs external validation to stay motivated, subscribe because this channel exists to help you build internal standards instead. There's a point where you realize success doesn't make you feel complete. It makes you exposed to your habits, your discipline, your patience, your ability to stay boring. And that exposure scares people who built their identity around struggle. Struggle is noisy. It gives you something to point to, something to blame. Success is quiet. It points everything back at you. That's why losing can feel lighter. It spreads responsibility across circumstances. Winning concentrates it. I want you to sit with this thought. If your trading suddenly became consistent tomorrow, what would you lose emotionally? Attention? Excitement? The identity of being almost there? That answer matters more than any strategy tweak. The traders who survive this phase don't eliminate fear. They reframe it. They stop seeing success as something to protect emotionally and start seeing it as something to manage mechanically. Systems, rules, risk, routine. They remove themselves from the equation as much as possible. That's not detachment from care. It's detachment from ego. At a certain point, fear stops shouting and starts whispering. It doesn't tell you to quit. It tells you to be careful. It tells you to slow down. It tells you to protect what you've built. And on the surface, that sounds responsible, but underneath that whisper is often the same fear that once made you overtrade, just wearing a more respectable mask. I've seen traders reach a place where everything is working and then slowly shrink themselves. Not because the edge disappeared, but because expansion felt dangerous. They reduced risk even when conditions were optimal. They passed on clean setups. They waited for perfect clarity that never comes. They told themselves they were being disciplined. What they were really doing was avoiding the emotional exposure that comes with sustained success. There's a guy named Evan who hit a rhythm after years of struggle. Same setups, same risk, consistent months. When I asked him why he hadn't scaled slightly, he said he didn't want to jinx it. That word mattered. Jinx. As if success was fragile luck instead of earned alignment. He still believed failure was the natural state and success was borrowed time. If you've ever felt like success might disappear if you acknowledge it too loudly, like the video because that belief quietly governs more behavior than most traders admit. Failure teaches you how to endure. Success teaches you how to trust, and trust is far more uncomfortable. Trust requires surrender. Surrender to probability. Surrender to variance. Surrender to the idea that you can do everything right and still experience drawdowns without panicking. Most traders never build that muscle because they never stay successful long enough to need it. When you fail, effort feels heroic. You're fighting uphill. When you succeed, effort feels invisible. You're maintaining. And maintenance doesn't feed the ego, it feeds results. That's why success scares people who came to trading for emotional payoff. It removes the drama. It removes the narrative. It leaves only responsibility. I had to confront this when I realized I was more motivated during drawdowns than during stable periods. Losses gave me something to fix, something to prove. Stability asked me to simply continue. And continuing without emotional spikes felt empty at first. That emptiness wasn't lack of purpose, it was lack of addiction. The final transformation happens when success no longer feels like something you're trying to protect emotionally. It becomes something you manage structurally. You stop asking how you feel about a trade. You ask whether you executed correctly. You stop celebrating streaks. You focus on ranges. You stop fearing losses. You expect them. That shift doesn't make you cold. It makes you stable. This is where success stops scaring you because it no longer defines you. It becomes a byproduct, not an identity, not a trophy, just evidence that your process is aligned. Most traders never reach this place because they don't realize success requires a different mindset than failure. Failure asks for resilience. Success asks for humility. Failure asks you to keep going. Success asks you to stay the same. If you're honest with yourself, you might realize you've been training for the wrong phase. You trained yourself to survive losses. You trained yourself to push through doubt. But you never trained yourself to handle calm, to handle boredom, to handle responsibility without external pressure. That's why success scares you more than losing ever did. Losing let you off the hook emotionally. Success keeps you on it. I want to leave you with this. The market doesn't punish fear. It punishes unexamined fear. When you understand what scares you about winning, you stop running from it. You stop sabotaging it. You stop shrinking when things go right. If this video put words to something you've felt but never said, share it with someone who's close to breaking through. Not to motivate them, to prepare them. Because success without preparation is just another way to fail. And if you're still here, still listening, still reflecting, that tells me you're not afraid of success. You're just learning how to carry it.